Carla Turner nos dejó una información muy importante sobre el modus operandi de las entidades tecnológicamente avanzadas, aliens, que forman parte de la corporación Arconte, quienes se dedican a realizar las abducciones a humanos y realizan experimentos genéticos en sus víctimas, así como de otros tipos, energéticos, de estudios sobre el alma humana e hibridación, entre muchos otros. En sus libros y conferencias habló del extraño suceso de la clonación humana en las víctimas y cuál era el motivo por el cual realizaban estos experimentos los alienígenas. Pero ahora veamos qué dijo sobre este tema tan fascinante y misterioso.
Where they're from, and we have a list, if you compile this, and at one point I think I tried to, a list of planet origins for these beings that include everything from the planet Lanacane to Banlon. They also have given us a variety of explanations as to why they're here and why they perform certain procedures. Often, however, these explanations are contradictory. And without going into a great deal of detail, I will point out just one example. I report on this in the book Taken. Several people, abductees that I have personally worked with, have been shown cloned bodies aboard craft or in facilities. And we'll talk a little bit more about the details of these in a moment. Just for purposes of the deception and the lying capability, I will use this little story. Pat, who's one of the cases in my book, was shown a copy of her body that was in storage with a number of other human bodies. She was told it was for the resurrection. And if you know your Bibles, you know when the resurrection comes, we will all get new bodies. Pat was raised in a very simple Christian fundamentalist background. The aliens, throughout their encounters with Pat and her family, had used the religious symbolism to bond with the family and to instill confidence in them. They'd even had Jesus beam into the room at one point when the Greys were abducting the grandmother and say, "It's okay, they're with me." Pat was told that this body, this cloned copy, would be her new body for the resurrection, and this was extremely moving and religious for this woman. However, another woman, also reported on in the book, was shown a copy of her new body in an entirely different scenario, of course, and was told, in fact, if she didn't cooperate with the agenda the aliens had picked out for her, she could be replaced with that body and nobody'd ever notice the difference. And in a third case, we actually had that occur on a temporary basis. A woman was abducted on her way to work and shown on a viewing screen her clone going to work in her place, and nobody knew the difference. So, are these bodies for the resurrection, blessed by God Himself, or are they threatened potential replacements? Aliens didn't get their stories quite straight in those cases. Fact number 3. In encounters, the human's perceptions are controlled, as are the human's conscious memories. Now, you already are very familiar, probably from the work of Hopkins and Jacobs and others, with the concept of screen memories, especially at the onset or at the conclusion of an abduction event, right? Someone may see a strange owl instead of the ET, or a little gray rabbit by the side of the car instead of an ET, or a beautiful deer, whatever. We're familiar with these screen events. What we may not be familiar with is the fact that the screen techniques go well beyond such temporary uses in the phenomenon. And we'll talk about that a little more later also. We're talking about control in fact number 3. It's also a fact that the perception of pain can be controlled and is controlled during these encounters with the particular abductees, as are feelings of physical pleasure, often sexual pleasure. And, of course, the human's emotions are also controlled during these encounters. The fact is, you are in control of these creatures during every encounter, to some degree, more or less, normally more. Fact number 4, false memories can overlay and disguise the actual events of an encounter. And even with regressive hypnosis, the abductee may recall false scenarios. I'm not talking false memory syndrome as so much has been ballyhooed lately in the press. That's not what I'm talking about. The abductee can recall false scenarios, even under regressive hypnosis, unless some effective method is used in the hypnotic process to help the abductee bypass implanted illusions. Some of you have heard me talk before. Remember an illustration of this concerning a woman named Joy, who in the 1970s had an encounter, a missing time and relocation episode in California. Was driving in one town, 2 hours later she's in another town, has no idea how she's gotten there. She's crying, she's in hysterics, and she feels totally abandoned and betrayed. 20 years later, when additional incidents occurred and finally compelled Joy to seek out some help to find out what was going on in her life, one of the events that she looked at under hypnosis was this 2 hours of missing time in the early 70s. She recalled in the initial stage that she was taken aboard a craft and brought by a regal and awe-inspiring figure who looked like the king and had on the robe and was very much in charge, into a room much like this, stood before a podium much like this, gazed out into an audience of wonderful smiling little grays, not at all like this, thank God, and was given a book and told to read this book to the audience. She looked at the book, and it had blue symbols or figures on it that she had never seen, and she said, I can't read this. I don't know what these symbols mean. And she was told, just put your hand over each symbol. You'll receive the impression, and then recite what you received to the audience. So Joy did this, and she would touch each symbol, and as she did, she would mentally receive a very warm, uplifting, wonderful spiritual message, which she would then recite to her audience. And she went through doing this, said the response she got was one of such love, such overwhelming acceptance. She was really awestruck by the experience. When the therapist, the hypnotist asked her to move forward, there was a jump, a gap in her story, and suddenly she's back in the car, crying, hysterical, and feeling very abandoned and betrayed. Now, as you know, that doesn't match up. There's a discrepancy between the emotional state she was in the car and this wonderful, awe-inspiring spiritual experience she had recalled. I think you'll agree they don't match up. The hypnotist noticed this, noticed the gap, and asked Joy to first program her mental computer to perceive only the truth, and second, to back up to maybe 5 or 10 minutes before she was in the car. When she did, Joy found herself in an extraordinarily different situation. She wasn't reading a book to a loving and warm audience. She was naked, suspended in a beam or tube of light, being poked and prodded by a group of aliens who were using her much as a biological chart to